Immediately after the voting of the maximum, there were unexpected signs of support for the Girondins in Paris. On 1st May, the Commune had decreed that a special extra levy of conscripts to fight in the Vendée would be made by popular societies designating recruits. It terrified better off elements who had already considered their property threatened by a special war tax on the rich, decreed on 9th March, but not yet implemented, not to mention the price controls involved in the maximum. Encouraged by Pétion from the convention, young muscadines, as well pomaded rejectors of the shaggy sans-culotte political style were coming to be known, seized control of several sectional assemblies, and denounced the popular despotism of the Commune. They also paraded in the Champs-Élysées calling for Marat to be guillotined. Steps taken against them were noisily denounced by the Girondin speakers in the convention. With ever more Montagnards or deputies who normally voted their way now absent on mission, the Mountain's usual ability to defeat Girondin eloquence with solid votes seemed threatened. These were the circumstances which finally swung them round to the idea of purging the convention. It went back at least to the failed Journée of 10th March, and delegates from 27 sections had begun meetings to coordinate action to save the country and liberty at the former Archbishop's Palace on 29th of March. A list of the most obvious candidates for purging had been endorsed by 33 sections on 15th of April. It was not, however, until a month later that positive plans began to be laid, and the Girondins knew all about them within hours. On 16th May, they denounced them in the convention. 2 days later, amid calls for a shadow convention to convene at Bourges to assume power if that in Paris were deprived of its freedom, it was agreed to establish a commission of 12 to investigate insurrectionary activity in Paris. The idea came from Barrère, no Girondin, but the members elected in a thin house on 20th May included several of them, and not a single Montagnard. Within 4 days, it had the evidence it was looking for after questioning Pache, the mayor. and scrutinizing sectional registers, recommending a strengthening of the National Guard around the convention and the closure of all sectional meetings by 10 in the evening. It ordered the arrest of those it had identified as the main plotters of insurrection. They included Varlet and, following a ferocious issue of Père Duchesne, in which he urged the sans-culottes to annihilate the Girondin traitors who conspired against the Republic, Hébert. When the Commune sent a deputation to object, Isnard, one of the more intemperate Girondins, who was currently president of the convention, brushed it aside, if, he declared, by these constantly recurring insurrections, it were to happen that the nation's representatives should suffer harm, I tell you, in the name of all France, that Paris would be annihilated. Brushing aside Marat, too, who protested that he was dishonoring the assembly, he went on, soon they would search along the banks of the Seine to see if Paris had ever existed. It was an empty threat, but its echoes of Brunswick's crude menaces the previous August outraged Parisians. For some weeks, the Girondins had been hinting at departmental vengeance for any attack Paris might make on the convention, and immediately before Isnard's outburst, a deputation from Marseille had been heard, denouncing the Montagnards. Ominous rumblings from other provincial cities, such as the Girondins' own Bordeaux, not to mention Lyon, were also now coming in. The Girondins had done nothing practical to organize such protests, but along with the struggles still going on in certain of the Parisian sections themselves, they convinced the insurrectionaries that their time was limited. Even Robespierre, who saw well enough the dangers of coercing the nation's representatives, now recognized that the deadlock in the convention must be broken by outside force. At the Jacobins on 26 May, he invited the people to rise up against the convention's corrupt deputies and declared himself an insurrection against them. The first step was to get rid of the Commission of 12, and late the same night, after a tumultuous session in which members of rival sections had spilled into the convention hall and fought each other, the few deputies who had not gone home exhausted voted to dissolve the commission. Those it had arrested were automatically released. 2 days later, it was reinstated, but promptly resigned when it was unable to get a hearing for its president. The deputies were still debating whether or not it existed and what it should do next if it did, when they were finally overtaken by the long-dreaded insurrection. It began in the small hours of 31st May when Varlet, in the name of the insurrectionary committee sitting at the Archbishop's palace, ordered the ringing of the tocsin. Soon after dawn, the insurrectionaries formally deposed the commune and reinstated it under their own orders. The gates were closed, a roundup of suspects ordered, and Henriot, a former clerk who had been made commander of the National Guard in the absence of Santerre the night before, was confirmed in office. But on this working day, the sans-culottes were slow to respond to the call to arms, and it soon became clear that, however much prior collusion there had been between the insurrectionary committee and the commune, there were divisions within both about how to proceed. Varlet wanted to dissolve the whole convention. Others sought the arrest of the 22 deputies named on 15 April. Still others, including the commune's procurator Chaumet, urged caution and seemed simply to want to force the abandonment of the Commission of 12 and to scare the Girondins into more moderate conduct. But the threatened deputies' reaction to the crowds who gathered all day around the convention soon showed there was no prospect of that, at least. They demanded an inquiry into the insurrection, and they had no trouble in getting a petition for their own arrest sidestepped by referring it to the Committee of Public Safety. Clearly, sensing the disarray of their antagonists, they refused to be intimidated and kept on uttering threats of departmental vengeance. By the time Robespierre moved the impeachment of those named in the petition, the crowds were melting away and the crisis seemed to have passed. All the insurrectionaries achieved was the final abandonment of the Commission of 12. Frustration, however, only increased the determination of the insurrectionary committee to oust its enemies from the convention once and for all. It was aided by the arrival of news on 1st June of the overthrow of the Jacobin Commune in Lyon, a new uprising in the Lozère, and further defeats in the Vendée. The departmental revenge so long evoked by the Girondins seemed to be beginning. There was no time to waste. The Montagnards concluded, if civil war was to be avoided, those seeking to foment it must be removed from the national representation. It was therefore agreed to renew the pressure on the convention on the 2nd, a Sunday, when the sans-culottes would not be at work. That morning, a deputation from the Commune presented a new petition for the arrest of 30 deputies. When it, in turn, was referred to the Committee of Public Safety, the cry went up for a report on the previous petition. This time, the petitioners were taking no chances. The previous evening, Henriot had posted his men in the key positions all around the convention. Estimates of the number of National Guardsmen on duty vary between 75 and 100,000, and they were reinforced by thousands more onlookers. No deputy took a chance of leaving the chamber, and when one group tried, they were turned back by Henriot and the guardsmen with drawn sabers. Barrère, in the name of the committee, refused to recommend the arrest of the named deputies. But by now it was clear that the surrounding forces would not go until the convention surrendered. They no longer had any choice, but before the day ended, therefore, they had decreed the arrest of 29 deputies, all but 2 of the 15 April list, and most of the commission of 12. 2 ministers were arrested under the same decree, and in the meantime, Roland and his wife had also been picked up on the authority of the Commune. Most deputies present abstained from the vote, visibly unwilling to violate the national representation under duress. The Montagnards, as always, were more realistic. Knowing they had no choice, they voted for the arrests in the hope of saving the convention from an even worse fate. They also saw that it would leave their own domination of the convention undisputed. The expulsion of the Girondins was neither the destruction of a party nor the overthrow of a government. Onlookers then and since certainly have often seen it in these ways as they groped to make sense of complex events and issues through a fog of rhetoric and recrimination. But the very idea of political parties was abhorrent to a generation whom Rousseau had taught to seek the general will, which is always for the best and never wrong. Even in Pitt's England, with its long parliamentary tradition, Fox was finding it difficult to convince most fellow MPs that party was in any way respectable or distinguishable from selfish and power-hungry faction. Girondins and Montagnards called each other factions, but as terms of abuse. Both vehemently denied the charge. There were certainly overlapping circles and groups of friends among those called Girondins around Brissot, around Roland, around the deputies from Bordeaux, but they never concerted their action in any sustained way, and they often voted divergently. Only when 22 of them were named as candidates for purging did they begin to respond to events with something like coordination. What made a Girondin was revolutionary intransigence, an attitude of mind that was not prepared to compromise the principles of 1789, whatever happened. This was the spirit that offered defiance to the whole of Europe as the war spread, and resisted the call for price controls, which all men of education believed to be economically disastrous. This was the spirit, too, which insisted that all France must be consulted on an issue as momentous as the death of the former king. Above all, this was the spirit that resisted the dictatorship of a capital apparently in the grip of men who had organized or at least connived at the September massacres. The representatives of the sovereign nation must not be subjected to the fickle and murderous whims of the sans-culotte and the blood-thirsty and irresponsible demagogues like Marat or Hébert, who pandered to them. All these were attitudes widely shared in the convention. In calmer times, very few of the deputies would have repudiated any of them. But the times were not calm, and there were certain realities which the Girondins refused to face. Without Paris, the Republic would not have been established, and the convention itself would not have existed. And however abhorrent the forces in control of the capital, it was only sensible for an assembly sitting there. And where else could it credibly sit to try to work with them? This was the Montagnard position. To Girondin intransigence they opposed prudence and practicality. And although the colonel of the Montagnards was the 24 deputies presenting Paris itself, who acted more like a party than the Girondins ever did, it is striking how often they were able to carry a majority in the convention on major questions like the fate of the king, the emergency measures of March, the establishment of the maximum, and even the toning down of the previously open-ended offer of fraternity and to help foreign peoples seeking their liberty. Girondin's successes only came when many deputies were absent and were not hard to reverse later. Their oratory outshone that of the Montagnards, but they were clearly far from dominating or controlling the convention. They were not therefore a government. France had no government in a normally recognized sense between August 1792 and June of 1793. Executive action emerged from the interplay between the Council of Ministers and a number of committees of the convention. And none of these bodies was clearly dominated by Girondins or Montagnards. Yet, there was also a real extension of governmental power, or at least pretensions, over the same period, and especially from March 1793. It was shown by the decree on conscription, the establishment of the Revolutionary Tribunal, the law of the maximum, and the creation of an embryonic war cabinet in the form of the Committee of Public Safety. Above all, it was shown by the institution of the representatives on mission, who, from being occasional special emissaries to troubled areas in the autumn of 1792, had by the following spring become a permanent presence in each of 41 pairs of departments, omnicompetent agents of the central power, charged by their fellow deputies with the implementation of laws to deal with the wartime emergency. Sometimes as many as 130 deputies at a time might be absent from the convention in this capacity. These men were the real governors of France during these months, in the sense that they were invested with the full authority of the National Convention to use as they saw fit. And in the sense, too, that when in Paris they tended to vote the same way as the Montagnards, a tendency which their provincial experience only reinforced. The Republic had something like a Montagnard government by the early spring of 1793. Only the absence of these same deputies on mission enabled the Girondins in the convention to look as strong as they did. The removal of their leading spokesmen did not hand control of the convention to the Montagnards. It merely made clear and explicit where control had already lain since the king's trial. Why then purge them at all? No single motive united all those involved in the Journée of 31 May and 2nd June. The sans-culottes wanted their enemies silenced at whatever cost. No compromise seemed possible with men who denounced patriotic Parisians as anarchists, blood drinkers, septembriseurs, and repeatedly invited the provinces to march on the capital and destroy it. The Montagnard fear was that Paris would pursue the quarrel at the expense of the convention itself. Varlet, Roux, and the Enragés had no trust in any representative form of government and repeatedly said so. Accordingly, until the very last minute, leading Montagnards such as Danton pleaded with the Girondins to stop attacking Paris and provoking the power in whose shadow they all sat. Besides, there was a war to fight, and it was not going well. It was no moment to be inciting civil war with inflammatory threats of departmental vengeance. If the Girondins had resigned themselves to the abolition of the Commission of 12, many clearly believed, and most probably hoped, that the insurrectionary impetus would have died. But Girondin intransigence was complete. Their quarrel with Paris was paralyzing the entire course of public affairs, if not endangering the very existence of the convention. Faced with such dangers, the practical, experienced men who made up its majority agreed with anguished reluctance to sacrifice a handful of their colleagues. Whether that would create as many problems as it solved was another matter. Nowhere was the news of the purge of the Girondins likely to have more effect than in Bordeaux. Reeling from the impact of upheavals in the Caribbean and British blockade, what only a few years beforehand had been the busiest port in Europe, had no cause to welcome the course the revolution had taken. Yet, in 1791, the department of the Gironde had sent eloquent radicals like Vergniaud, Gensonné, and Guadet to the National Assembly, and it had returned them a year later to the Convention. Bordeaux was not without Montagnard sympathizers, congregating in the National Club, which had close links with the Paris Jacobins. But the city's political life was dominated by the rival Friends of Liberty, where the Girondin deputies took their first steps in politics, and whose rules dedicated it to the maintenance and strengthening of the Constitution and of liberty, and discussion of all questions relating to public welfare and general tranquility. Members of this club dominated most of Bordeaux's 28 sections, and throughout the winter of 1792 and 3, they took their cues from their deputies in Paris. In March, they even succeeded in having the National Club closed. And as early as January, they were talking about sending a departmental force to Paris to protect the convention from violation. On 5th of May, after being compelled to swallow the maximum, Vergniaud decided that the time had come for more positive action. "Men of the Gironde," he wrote, "rise up. The convention has only been weak because it has been abandoned. Support it against all the furies threatening it. There is not a moment to lose. If you develop great energy, you will impose peace on men who are provoking civil war. Your generous example will be followed, and virtue will triumph at last." The Bordeaux sections responded with blood-curdling threats against the convention, but they took no action. Unlike Marseille or Lyon, until news arrived of the purge of 2nd June, which involved 5 of the Gironde's deputies. Even then, it took reports and urgings to collective action from elsewhere to push them beyond mere verbal protest. But on 7 June, a popular commission of public safety was set up, declaring the city in insurrection against a faction-dominated convention until the purged deputies were restored. Bombarding its own citizens with anti-Montagnard propaganda, it also sent out representatives to other cities it deemed ripe for resistance, including those known already to have rejected Parisian dominance. Their message was twofold. They urged that the departments should unite to elect the shadow convention at Bourges, which Girondin deputies had been proposing before they were silenced. And more important, they pressed all areas which rejected the purged convention's authority to raise volunteers to march on Paris and restore constitutional government. They spoke optimistically of 80,000 men, hinted at support from the UMI, and on 14 June announced the formation of a departmental force of 1,200 as the Gironde's contribution. Marseille and Lyon, already in revolt, were much encouraged by this response to an event that anti-Jacobins in both cities had long predicting. They were already cooperating between themselves. One of the first steps of the Lyon insurrectionaries had been to send fraternal delegates down the Rhone to coordinate with the Marseillaise. And they arrived just as the news from Paris broke. In Marseille, a popular tribunal was re-established in defiance of a decree from the convention on 15 May suppressing a previous version. It was used to persecute Montagnard sympathizers throughout the Bouches-du-Rhône department. On 12th June, Marseille formally declared itself in a legal state of resistance against oppression and announced the formation of a departmental army which would march on Paris under the slogan, "One and indivisible republic, respect for persons and properties." By early July, it was advancing on Avignon, which it occupied. Meanwhile, at the other end of the Rhone, Lyon had followed Bordeaux in establishing a popular commission on 24th June, which ordered the raising of a departmental force intended to number 10,000. Eventually, it did reach about 4,000. But in mid-July, the convention proclaimed Lyon a city in rebellion and advised all loyal citizens to leave. The new authorities responded by executing Chalier, whom it took 4 falls of a blunt guillotine blade to dispatch. Other southern cities were now drawn in. On 11th June in Montpellier, the Departmental Council of the Hérault ordered the raising of a force to march on Paris. In Toulouse and Grenoble, both near to frontiers where the enemy was on the offensive, the authorities agonized before eventually drawing back from endorsing the Bourges Convention or the idea of departmental armies. But at Toulon, which had at first taken the news of 2nd June calmly, mid-July witnessed the beginning of what was to be perhaps the most dangerous and certainly the longest lasting attempt to repudiate the authority of the convention. Like Marseille, Toulon had been ruled by pro-Montagnard Jacobins since the summer of 1792. Although it had taken a massacre of local officials in July to open their way to power. Their position owed nothing to the city's sections, which during the autumn ceased to meet. But seeing how the sections of nearby Marseille over the following spring spearheaded the overthrow of Jacobinism there, anti-Jacobins in Toulon began campaigning for the sections to be reopened. Disillusion with the convention was now widespread among the workers of the naval dockyard, as the war with Great Britain and Spain increased their workload and swamped them with migrant workers, while at the same time their wages began to be paid in depreciating assignats. Like the dockers of Marseille, they proved ready recruits in the struggle of the local notables against Jacobin leveling. The Jacobins tried to block the campaign for reopening the sections with armed demonstrations intended to remind their opponents of the previous summer's bloodshed. But all they achieved was their own overthrow. On 13 July, the sections began to meet again of their own accord. And on the 14th, a general committee was elected to coordinate their activity. Three days later, this committee dissolved the town council after closing the Jacobin Club and arresting its leaders. A popular tribunal was set up as at Marseille, and over the summer, it handed down 30 death sentences, mostly against known Jacobin supporters and activists. On 15 July, it even arrested and imprisoned 2 representatives on mission. In contrast with the other southern cities in revolt, Toulon saw a revival of religious activity under municipal auspices. Yet, the social orientation of the rebel authorities was much the same elsewhere. We want to enjoy our goods, our property, the fruits of our toil and industry in peace, declared the revived sections in August. Yet we see them incessantly exposed to threats from those who have nothing themselves. Not all the anti-Montagnard revolts occurred south of the Loire. The remote department of the Jura, for instance, on the Swiss frontier, was one of those which set up a departmental army. Neighboring departments followed suit, although their projected march on distant Paris never began. Far more serious, because far closer to the capital and to the royalist rebels of the Vendée, were outbreaks of defiance in Brittany and Normandy. As late as 25th May, the General Council of the Department of the Île-et-Vilaine, meeting in Rennes, declared that it wanted Republican unity. Neither Robespierre, nor Godet, Danton, or Gensonné, neither mountain nor valley, or any of those lines of demarcation which degrade the dignity of the people's representatives. But one of those purged from the convention had a week earlier was their own deputy, Langevin, and within a week they had committed themselves to the formation of a departmental army to march on Paris and liberate him and his colleagues. Other Breton departments rallied in support. From Finistère, Quimper called for the suppression of the Revolutionary Tribunal, coordinated action, and the convocation of the Bourges Shadow Convention, and all sought from the start to link up with protesters in the Norman department of Calvados, where Ken had denounced the convention on 31st May on hearing of the first dissolution of the Commission of 12. On 9th June, Cayenne declared itself in a state of insurrection in resistance to oppression and arrested 2 deputies on mission who were in the department supervising coastal defenses. The leaders also approached the local military commander, Wimpfen, with requests for help. Unknown to them, Wimpfen was a royalist and possibly in English pay. He proved very responsive. When on 30th of June, Cayenne became the headquarters of a central assembly of resistance to oppression, claiming to represent 6 Breton departments as well as Calvados, Wimpfen accepted command of its armed forces, whose notional numbers now exceeded 3,000. By then, the rebels were also encouraged by the arrival, in the days following 9th of June, of a number of the proscribed Girondin deputies themselves, who had escaped from the lax house arrest under which they had been placed on 2nd June. They included Buzot, Louvet, and Pétion, and at first they were lionized by the richest inhabitants of Cayenne. But, noted Pétion, it did not last. When their hosts discovered that the Girondins had not been turned royalist by their treatment, their attitude rapidly cooled. They detested the mountain most cordially, he recalled, but they liked Republicans no better. Thus surfaced one of the many divisions that were to bedevil and ultimately doom what Parisians called the Federalist Revolt. But these weaknesses were not visible at the start, and certainly not from the viewpoint of the capital. From there, it looked to many in June 1793 as if much of France was in revolt against the Convention, and there was wild talk, too often repeated uncritically by historians, of 60 or 70 out of the 83 departments repudiating central authority. Centres of revolt, of course, had every interest in making similar claims. More sober observers, even at the time, refused to be panicked. On 31 July, the administrator of nationalized property, whose office was naturally sensitive to the slightest tremor of anti-revolutionary activity, noted serious resistance in only 8 departments. Nevertheless, the country's 2nd, 3rd, and 4th cities lay in these recalcitrant districts. So the Federalist challenge could scarcely be brushed aside. What was easier was to misunderstand it. It was not an attempt, however it might look, to break up the one and indivisible republic in the eyes of the rebels wherever they rose. It was Paris which was sowing division in the republic by dictating to and then tampering with the deputies elected by the rest of the nation. The revolution of 1789 had been against centralization, that tool of Bourbon despotism. The failure of the Constitution of 1791 to guarantee the disappearance of despotism had produced the convention, but its purpose was supposedly to strengthen rather than abandon the principles of 1789. and not least local autonomy. Yet, instead, new intendants, the representatives on mission, had been sent out to the provinces with limitless powers. And although they came on behalf of the sovereign nation incarnated in the convention, the body itself was now hostage to the anarchists and blood drinkers of the Paris sections. Nor were the leaders of federalism royalists. Although royalists were happy to lend them support if it would foment division in Republican ranks, as the commanding general in the Southwest reported of the Bordelais on 5th of June. They appeared to me determined not to involve themselves in Parisian affairs, but more determined still to retain their liberty, their property, their opulence. They did not want a king, they want a republic, but a rich and tranquil republic. That, however, could scarcely mean a republic at war. And what the Federalists appear to have resented, if anything even more than the grip of the sans-culotte on elected deputies, was the range of emergency measures any government would have felt obliged to take to cope with the downturn in French fortunes that spring. Conscription, enhanced police powers, market controls, enforced loans, actual or threatened, were now coming on top of years of upheaval tolerated only because of the promise of calmer times to come. For ports, there was the added blow of enemy activity. Whatever their losses, men of property doubtless rode out these tribulations better than those with little or none. But the disappearance over the summer of 1792 of the distinction between active and other citizens seemed to place the power to exercise authority enhanced by the emergency in the hands of those with least to lose. Embattled Jacobins in Marseille, Lyon, and Toulon were reckless in their reliance on threats against property to retain power seized in the aftermath of the fall of the monarchy. Inevitably, they expected support from the Montagnards. And inevitably, they got it. But just as inevitably, those who turned against one turned against the other. Nor was it just the rich, although they certainly gave the lead. Federalism could never have got the grip it did, however transitory it proved, without support from many ordinary people who feared and resented what Jacobinism meant for them in the form of instability, inflation, and short ages, similar preoccupations, ironically enough, to those of the sans-culottes in Paris. And they no more wished to be conscripted to fight against distant enemies than the peasants of the Vendée or Brittany. This attitude proved more irony, fatal for the very resistance they supported. For the most striking failure of federalism was the dismal record of its departmental armies. If Marseille was able to make up a force which at its largest seems to have reached 3,500 men, Bordeaux only put together a third of its 1,200 target. When the first Breton volunteers arrived in Cayenne, they paraded through the town, expecting to be joined by swarms of Norman recruits. Only 17 came forward, and the Finistère battalions almost went home there and then. Nor did those who did volunteer show much willingness to march far from home. The Marseillais never got beyond Avignon. The Bordelais marched south rather than towards Paris and ended up encamped in vineyards a mere 20 miles up from the Garonne. A combined Breton and Norman force did better, leaving Cayenne on 8th of July. About 2,000 men passed Évreux on the 12th, making for the Seine. But the next day they turned tail and ran at the first shots from forces sent against them by the convention at Brécourt. They did not stop running until they were back in the Calvados. Reluctance to leave their home territory was also to bedevil the Catholic and royal armies of the Vendée. But in June 1793, this weakness had not yet emerged as they continued to drive Republican troops before them. On 10 June, a hitherto unknown leader, a petty nobleman of some military experience called Charette, took Machecoul from Blues, who had captured it in April. On the 19th, the rebels crossed the Loire and entered Angers, which the Republicans had evacuated. On the 29th, they appeared before the greatest prize of all, the Atlantic port of Nantes. Throughout the spring, Nantes had been one of the foremost centres of support for the Girondins against Parisian and Montagnard extremism. But as the forces of counter-revolution approached, the city authorities recognized that it was no moment to renounce the convention. Appeals from other Breton cities to provide a contingent for the departmental army assembling at Cayenne were rebuffed. So was a call to surrender from the Vendéan army. The attack, when it came, was ill-coordinated, and the city resisted with more determination than its besiegers had ever expected. After 2 days of the assault, the attackers withdrew. Nantes, however, grudgingly, had held firm for the Jacobin Republic against its enemies of both types. The worst moment in the Montagnard struggle to keep control of France had passed. It was fortunate for them that their opponents were so divided and uncoordinated, because even in Paris itself, the weeks after the purge of 2nd June were chaotic. Few deputies positively welcomed the purge of national representatives, and a number who had no special links with the proscribed deputies went out of their way to condemn the deed openly in their letters to their constituents. 75 signed a secret protest between 6 and 19 June. It would later be used to condemn the signatories in their turn as Girondins. The loose conditions of arrest imposed on the 29, while the convention decided what to do next with them, also showed how reluctant their colleagues were to treat them as criminals. Only when a number of them escaped from Paris were those remaining confined more closely. To the radicals who had launched the insurrection on 31st May, such laxity smacked of treachery. All the more so as the Montagnards had shown themselves determined from the moment of their triumph on 2nd June to dissociate themselves from the allies who made it possible. From 3rd of June onwards, the Committee of Public Safety began a relentless campaign to whittle away the independence of the Central Committee of the sections which had organized the insurrection. And on the 8th, it was merged into a body firmly under the control of the constituted departmental authorities. At the same time, the Montagnards sought through popular gestures to cut the ground from under the feet of those who expected a radical new dawn, such as the Enragés. Already on 2nd June itself, before proscribing the Girondins, the convention had voted in principle to establish a revolutionary army. There was nothing military about this idea, which had first surfaced in April and become a staple of discussion in the sections over succeeding weeks. This sort of army would be a band of patriotic vigilantes, solid sans-culottes, who would march into the countryside or anywhere else their services might be required to root out and punish traitors, hoarders, moderates, the indifferent, and suspects of all sorts. On the same day, the convention also voted to discuss the Constitution in every afternoon until a draft was ready. Moving with determined speed, it had produced by 10th June one which was deliberately designed to win popular approval in both Paris and the country at large. Gone in this project were the checks, balances, and elaborate electoral limitations proposed by Condorcet in February and hotly debated since then. The separation of powers and extreme decentralization, deemed so essential in 1789, were also largely abandoned. The Constitution of 1793 provided for a unicameral legislature elected annually by direct manhood suffrage, and the legislature would choose the executive council. It was prefaced by a Declaration of Rights twice as long as that of 1789, which guaranteed to all citizens, in addition to the rights proclaimed then, public assistance when in need, state education, and the right to resist oppression by insurrection. On 24th June, the project was ratified, and copies were sent out to all the primary assemblies which had elected the convention for their approval in a sort of referendum. The aim was to secure this approval by the first anniversary of the fall of the monarchy on 10th of August. Meanwhile, the convention also moved to appease the peasantry. On 3rd June, the sale of émigré property in small, affordable lots was ordered. On the 10th, it was decreed that all common lands might be redistributed among inhabitants of the communities where they were situated. On 17 July, all remaining feudal rights, still notionally in existence until bought out, were abolished outright without compensation. All documents relating to them were to be collected and officially burned.